think. Here it is.
This is a beautiful meeting.
Good morning. Since it seems that most of us are here already, we will go ahead and start with prayer. Shine within our hearts, loving Master, the pure light of your divine knowledge, and open the eyes of our minds that we understand the message of your gospel. Instill in us also the reverence for your blessed commandments, so that putting down all sinful desires, we may pursue a spiritual life, thinking and doing all those things that are well-pleasing to you. If you're blessed together, beginning with Father, and you're also living life-creating Spirit, now and forever, into the ages of ages. Amen. All right. So, let's go ahead and review a little bit. What did we talk about last week?
We talked about Jacob and Genesis 27:28.
Mm-hmm.
What are we studying now?
We are
Thank you very much, ma'am.
We are studying Genesis, and right now we are in the story of Jacob.
Jacob and Esau. And,
What is this, 27?
no, we're to be 29.
Correct. What I typically do is at the beginning of each class, I do a review of what we discussed previously.
Okay.
So Jacob and Esau gave up. Esau deceived his father.
Yes.
Jacob
Isaac.
deceived his father.
For a bowl of porridge.
Jacob deceived his father by having his mother put hair on him so they could get the blessing. So Jacob got the blessing.
Esau gave up his birthright.
Well, that was before, yeah.
Why was that significant? Why was it significant that Esau took his...
Cindy Schroeder.
Say that again?
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. The question that I posed was, why was it significant that Esau lost his birthright? Why does that matter? What was...
Well, he was the first. I guess he came out first.
He was the firstborn, so by right, it should have been his birthright. But it didn't end up being his birthright. Why? What?
Because he gave it up for some porridge. He was so hungry.
It wasn't just that he gave it up for some porridge. And it wasn't just that...
Because he wasn't a godly man. He didn't put God first.
He did not put God first. How do we know that? How do we know that Esau was not godly?
Just the fact that when he sold his birthright, that he didn't consider that he was so hungry that he gave it up just for temporary food.
Well,
and he married out of the faith.
Correct. He married out of he married out of his tribe. He married the
Okay.
Canaanites. And why would that be significant? Why? I mean, that seems kind of xenophobic to us a little bit. That he didn't marry part of that clan. Why does that matter?
It matters. Even in the New Testament, it says marry only a believer.
Correct.
It's important that we stay within the faith.
So when Esau married outside of that, when he married outside of his tribe, he was essentially committing himself to worshiping the way they worshipped. So in other words, he was not worshiping just God. He was not worshiping in the same context as his father as his father Isaac and his grandfather Abraham. So Esau was essentially going down that path. Now, I had said it in last week's class that this parallels to when Jesus Christ was talking about the banquet. Why was that? When Jesus Christ said...
because he invites everybody to the banquet, but not everybody chooses to
Right, and what was one of the reasons why one of the people said, well, I can't come, have me excused?
I took a wife.
I took a wife.
I took a wife. That's
Which is symbolic of the idea that I have gone into a foreign religion. Because oftentimes, and we still see this to this day, that if two people get married and one spouse is very, very into his or her faith, the other one is going to naturally follow it. And so we see that Esau was not deeply into that. And then in addition to that, how was Esau treating the blessing of his birthright?
very nonchalant. He doesn't.
It wasn't just nonchalant, but he treated it almost in the same way that the Canaanites were treating it, almost like a magical talisman. The idea that somehow this is what's going to make me successful. Not the idea of worshiping and having a relationship with God, but the idea that if I have this blessing, then that means everything in my life is going to go well. And this was one of the reasons why we saw multiple times, both with Abraham and with Isaac, and soon to be with Jacob, that people like having them around just because God seems to bless them. Whereas Esau treated it was basically in the same context. He wasn't treating it like a relationship with God. He was treating it as just a magical thing. And this is why when he realizes that, his father has already given the blessing to Jacob, he says, well, give me something. You've got to have something. You got to have something in your magic bag of tricks for me. And what do we notice in this? Because Isaac realized he was deceived. This is before he does the prayer on Jacob. And yet he still says that, I'm sorry, it's going to Jacob now, and you're going to have to serve your brother. What does that tell us?
Like Jesus said, the first shall be last and the last first.
Mm-hmm. There's definitely that.
Since he already spoke it out and gave it to Jacob, he couldn't pull it back.
This is important because we look at this and say, well, why couldn't Isaac just say, well, you tricked me, so it's going to naturally go to Esau? It was because he probably in his own heart recognized that despite the fact that he preferred Esau as his firstborn son, that he recognized it wasn't the right decision. And that because he had made the declaration that Jacob would receive his blessing and the inheritance, he decided, well, God has so willed this, and so it is going to be. And because we see a little bit of the humanity playing out here, that this is not just a story of just almost robotic people that are just doing things, but we see that they are humans, that they have faults, they have desires, and we can see this even in today's society. When somebody commits atrocities, the parents are still, you know what, I don't condone what my child did, but I still love my child. And so Jacob definitely loved his son Esau. So before we continue into chapter 29, are there any questions from last week leading into this week?
It's just very hard to understand in today's,
Mrs. Tobias, I'm having difficulty hearing you.
Oh, can you hear me now?
Yes, a little better.
Okay, no, it's just hard for me to, grasp. I understand, what you're saying about the inheritance and the tricking, but, as a parent, you think, well, this doesn't even make sense. I mean, to bless one and not the other. You know what I mean? I mean, it's hard for, in the human sense, to understand that. Like he's almost like ignoring the other son, like, oh, well, sorry, kid,
Love all equally.
All your children. Why, it's not equally blessed.
There is not the idea of equality in this because there has to be an heir. That the idea of a linear progression of the head. This was to be, a singular person. So it was not going to be just spread out and diluted. It was a single. And we see this, for example, in all throughout history. Who's going to inherit the castle? Who's going to be king? So it's not like okay, well, all of your children are going to rule the kingdom together. It doesn't work that way. There is an heir. There is somebody that is going to be the Lord. It doesn't mean you're not going to take care of the person. We saw this with Ishmael. We saw this with Esau. That still, even though they were not the heir, they were still well taken care of. So there is that element of parental taking care of the children. Does that make sense?
Yeah, in other words, he's not, you can't rule, Jacob's going to rule.
Well, that's essentially it. That's what he's saying. He's saying you are not going to be the ruler. Jacob will be the ruler. So now we're going to get into the story of Jacob and Rachel. So chapter 29. Now, as just a little bit of a precursor to this, and again, part of the dynamic between Esau and Jacob, leading into 29 is where his father Isaac tells Jacob, you are going to go to the land of Mesopotamia to find a wife from our people. And what does Esau do immediately after that? He went to Ishmael's people to get a wife. In other words, he did that trying to please his family. Like, okay, I messed up by going this way. Well, I'll get a wife from our family too. And yet he still misses the point because he goes and gets a wife from people that are not part of that. Again, removed. So Esau still does not understand why he is not being chosen, why God has allowed this to happen, because Esau, through his own actions, his own choices, has separated himself from God and his own people. And he is now living according to his own selfish desires. So let's start chapter 29. Now Jacob went on his journey and came to the land of the east, to Laban. And he looked and saw a well in the field, and behold, there were 3 flocks of sheep lying by it. For out of that well they watered the flocks, and a large stone was on the well's mouth. And all the flocks would be gathered there, and they would roll the stone from the well's mouth, water the sheep, and put the stone back in its place on the well's mouth. So Jacob said to them, My brethren, where are you from? And they said, We are from Haran. And he said to them, Do you know Laban, the son of Nahor? And they said, We know him. So he said to them, Is he well? He said, He is well. Look, his daughter Rachel is coming with the sheep. Then he said, It is still high day. It is not time for the cattle to be gathered together. Water the sheep and go and feed them. But they said, We cannot, until all the shepherds are gathered together, and they have rolled the stone from the well's mouth. Then we will water the sheep. Now while he was still speaking with them, Rachel came with her father's sheep, for she was a shepherdess. And it came to pass, when Jacob saw Rachel, the daughter of Laban, his mother's brother, and the sheep of Laban, his mother's brother, Jacob went near and rolled the stone from the well's mouth, and watered the flock of Laban, his mother's brother. Then Jacob kissed Rachel, and lifted up his voice and wept. So Jacob told Rachel he was her father's relative from Rebekah's son. And she ran and told her father these words. Then it came to pass, when Laban heard the report about Jacob, his sister's son, that he ran to meet him, and embraced him, and kissed him, and brought him into his house. So he told Laban all these things. And Laban said to him, Surely you are my bone and my flesh. And he stayed with him for a month. Now, the Orthodox Study Bible says that Laban called Jacob my bone and my flesh, for they were blood relatives. In contrast to this, the church is not based on blood relationships. It is based on the life-giving flesh of Christ, by which those who embrace him in faith become members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. The members of his body are closer in relationship than blood relations. So we are seeing a little bit here this concept of family and what it means to be family. So the precursor is make sure that you're in the same family. But the spirit behind it, the reason why God wanted Abraham to do this and his son do it and his grandson to do this, was so that eventually we'd get the idea of to be in the same faith, to find someone that believes as you do, to worship God as you do. Then Laban said to Jacob, Because you are my brother, should you therefore serve me for nothing? Tell me, what should your wages be? Now Laban had 2 daughters. The name of the elder was Leah, and the name of the younger was Rachel. Leah's eyes were delicate, but Rachel was beautiful in form and appearance. Now Jacob loved Rachel, so he said, I will serve you 7 years for Rachel, your younger daughter. So Laban said, It is better that I give her to you than to another man. Stay with me. So Jacob served 7 years for Rachel, and they seemed only a few days to him because of the love he had for her. So he basically made himself an indentured servant to his uncle and worked the fields and worked as a shepherd, all because he wanted to marry Rachel. Then Jacob said to Laban, Give me my wife, for my days are fulfilled, that I may go into her. Now Laban gathered together all the men of the place and made a wedding feast. Thus it came to pass, the evening he took Leah his daughter and brought her to Jacob, and he went into her. So Laban gave his maid Zilpah to his daughter Leah as a handmaiden. Then it came to pass in the morning, behold, it was Leah, and he said to Laban, What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? Now,
Jacob was the deceiver, and it came back on him.
Exactly right. And this is something that, people seem to forget, that when we do something, even when God is with us, even when God ultimately is going to take care of us, there are consequences. And we have to live with those consequences. That doesn't mean that God has abandoned us. It doesn't mean that God is going to forsake us when we make mistakes. But there will be, for our own benefit, struggles, trials. And so, yes, the deceiver was deceived. What is this you have done to me? Was it not for Rachel that I served you? Why then have you deceived me? Laban replied, It must not be done in our country to give the younger before the firstborn. Fulfill her week, and I will give you this one also for the service you will render me still another 7 years.
It says 7 days here.
It's a week. It's actually a year.
Okay.
It's a year, 7 years.
Then Jacob did so and fulfilled her week. So he gave him his daughter Rachel as wife also. Laban also gave his handmaiden Bilhah to his daughter Rachel as a handmaiden. Then Jacob also went into Rachel, and he loved Rachel more than Leah, and he served with Laban still another 7 years. So now he has basically worked as a slave, for all intents and purposes, an indentured servant, for 14 years.
Now, did he go in with her? Did he have relations with her after the 14 years or before that?
According to what it sounds like here, it sounds like he was given Rachel after a week.
Yeah, okay.
But in order to legally as his wife, he basically had to fulfill another 7 years.
But would he have to be the wife in order for them to have relations? Otherwise,
Correct. So they're married, but in order for him to basically leave, he needs to fulfill. And because he is a man of promises.
I never saw that before. I always thought it was after 14 years. Looking at it now, it looks like he had.
So he was married to Leah for a week, and then got married to Rachel right after that.
No, wait a minute. That lost.
A week is 7 years.
Okay.
So the week.
Yeah,
So he's married to Leah for a week.
he was married to Leah for a week.
Right.
Okay.
And then he's also married to Rachel.
Right.
And then, in addition to that, 7 years of servicehood.
Okay.
So now he has 2 wives, and he's already worked 7, and now he's got to work another 7. And so now, all total, he's worked 14
But he
years.
got a wife before he had to work the 7 years off, right?
The second one, correct. And basically, so he was kind of sold a bill that he wasn't aware of, that basically, well, no, we have to marry off the oldest daughter first before we can marry off the younger, which obviously wasn't very nice. But we also see something here that is important for us to understand, that because obviously we live in a very monogamous society today. In Christianity, of course, we believe in monogamy, the idea of one man, one wife. And yet somehow we see within the patriarchs this idea of multiple partners. And again, we have to understand this within the context of history, that this was their norm. And what we're seeing is slow progression towards what will become the norms of what we would be considering our norms. Because basically at this time, God is seen as just one of many gods, and he is stronger than the other gods.
I have a question for you. Did it occur in the New Testament that was actually where it started with a one man? Because he says a deacon, I think, has to be a man of only one wife. The leaders.
Correct.
So it seems like that's, I don't know, maybe it started elsewhere.
Even before that, we were starting to see this concept of only one spouse. But again, it's this progression of revelation that we start to see more and more and more. So, for example, even King David, who was, a man after God's heart, it says, he still had multiple wives.
14 wives.
And,
14? Wow.
and so we see this progression of what is going to become the norm, what is going to become good. And so we see that God slowly over time changes us, changes our behavior. He is coming from El Shaddai, just the God of the mountain, to the one Lord, the one God. All this we get to before we finally get to Jesus Christ. But even with this, there's still this concept that even if there's like 14 wives, there's still the main wife. So for example, the children that we're going to count as the 12 patriarchs, who do they come from? They come from Rachel.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
So starting on verse 31. But when the Lord saw Leah was hated, he opened her womb, but Rachel was barren. So Leah conceived and bore Jacob a son, and she called his name Reuben. For she said, the Lord truly looked on my humiliation. Now therefore my husband will love me. Then she conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. And she said, because the Lord heard I was hated, he has therefore given me this son also. So she called his name Simeon. She conceived again and bore a son, and said, now this time my husband will be on my side, because I bore him 3 sons. Therefore she called his name Levi. Now she conceived again and bore a son and said, now I will give thanks to the Lord. Therefore she called his name Judah. Then she stopped bearing. So how many children is that? These are Leah's children.
They're not part of the 12 tribes.
They are part of the 12. They are part of the 12 tribes. And why is this happening? Why is Rachel barren and Leah is conceiving children?
Because God is chastising Jacob.
It's not that he's chastising Jacob. It's to show, was Leah at any fault in this?
No.
Did she deceive her husband? Did she was a daughter obeying her father.
Right.
And so, but the reality still was that Jacob didn't want her. He wanted Rachel.
Right.
And so this, girl is kind of cast off to the side. It's like, okay, well, I have no value. And remember what we talked about several chapters back when we were talking about Lot's daughters. Why did they sleep with their father? As disgusting as that was.
Because the only way to have worth was to have children.
Because their only feeling of worth was to have children. So in other words, if a woman does not have children, she is not considered of worth. And so the fact that now Leah has borne children shows that she has worth, that she has value as a person. And she has borne 3 sons. That means that not only do I have value, I've given you, because we are legally married, I've given you 3 potential heirs. And so she's saying, now he will love me.
She had a 4th, Levi.
Right.
Or not Levi,
Judah. So, chapter 30. Now when Rachel saw that she bore Jacob no children, Rachel envied her sister and said to Jacob, give me children or else I die. So Jacob's anger was aroused against Rachel, and he said, am I in the place of God, who has withheld from you the fruit of the womb? She replied to Jacob, here is my maid Bilhah. Go into her, and she will bear on my knees, that I also may have children by her. She then gave him Bilhah, her maid, as wife, and Jacob went into her. Thus Bilhah, Rachel's handmaiden, conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Rachel said, God has judged me, and he has heard my voice, and given me a son. Therefore she called his name Dan. Now the Orthodox Study Bible says, starting from verse 29. Levi was the forefather of the Levitical priesthood, also known as the order of Aaron, for Aaron came from Levi. But the Christ could not be part of this order because he would descend from Judah. However, the prophecy said Christ would be the high priest of the order of Melchizedek. Thus, both orders cannot coexist as the ways to be perfected. The order of Aaron became obsolete because Levi and his offspring are still dead, whereas Christ is alive from the dead. Therefore, the Jews are not made children of God to the order of Aaron. Both Jews and Gentiles became the children of God only through the order of Melchizedek, in the one body of Christ, the church, which is also called the Israel of God. Now, verse 6 says, or chapter 30, the names of the son of Jacob reveal things concerning the incarnation of the Son of God. For example, Rachel speaks of Dan's birth in relation to God as judge. Christ shall come to judge the living and the dead. Also, Reuben's birth relates to humiliation. The son humbled himself to become man for salvation. Simeon's birth emphasizes hatred. Christ was hated without cause, and sometimes so is the church. Levi's birth speaks of union. On my side speaks of union. Christ unites his church to himself in baptism. Judah's birth relates to thanksgiving. Christ established the Eucharist, which means thanksgiving. Naphtali's birth emphasizes victory. Christ prevailed over death by triumphing over it through the cross. So see, each of these children are thematic in nature. And looking at the Orthodox Study Bible, I take back what I said earlier. It says that 1 week in this case equals 7 years. Thus, each week in Daniel's prophecy equals 7 years, Daniel 9, to the coming of Christ to the incarnation. This is how Daniel, the prophet, was able to prophesy exactly to the day, basically, when the Messiah would be born.
It's amazing because it's so specific, and yet people, like Jewish people, they have that right in front of them, and they don't know. And it says the temple, right, at that time, which it did at 70 AD.
Mm-hmm.
So the Messiah already has to have come. He had to come before the temple was destroyed.
Correct. The reality is that if we are choosing not to believe in God, it's because of our own hardness of heart.
I was just in Israel. I came back 3 weeks ago today.
Oh, God.
I was in Christ's tomb. I got baptized in the Jordan River.
Mm-hmm.
It was just, since I can't walk well, everybody had to be my cane, and I missed out on some stuff, but it was just
Well, glory
the
be to
most
God.
wonderful experience I've ever had in my life.
Amen. St. Nectarius tells us through his work on Christology, which he wrote about 100 years ago, there are approximately 450 specific prophecies of Jesus Christ, all of them fulfilled in exactitude by Jesus Christ. Now, statistically, because these are prophecies that span, more than 1,000 years of writings, statistically, during that span of 1,000 years, for all 450 of those specific prophecies, they were not vague, they were specific, to be all true about a single human being, a single individual, well, statistically, that's nigh impossible. That's something that should not be possible, and yet...
I heard David Reagan. He said that the odds of even 8 of those prophecies being fulfilled in the lifetime of one person was the odds of putting a silver dollar in the whole state of Texas and going 8 feet deep, and putting one silver dollar in the midst of the whole state of Texas 8 feet deep, and what are the odds of the person being blindfolded and picking one thing out, one coin out?
And it had a mark on it, or
It has the
something.
mark on it. And that's the odds of only 8 prophecies being fulfilled,
Right.
which is impossible.
Meaning, for 450, you're looking at something that, if we're being realistic here, there's just, you cannot ignore that. And yet, the reality is, proof means nothing if we are hard of heart.
Right.
Jesus Christ numerous times gave proof upon proof upon proof of who he is.
Yes.
And when the Israelites asked him, prove to us that you are who you are, during the time of Christ, the vehicle of being able to prove a statement was to say, if 2 people can corroborate what you are saying, then we will believe it is true. Jesus Christ doubled it, gave them 4. Said, the Father bears witness unto me. John the Baptist bears witness unto me. The prophets bear witness unto me. My works bear witness unto me. It was twice, double what they asked for, double what they needed to corroborate what he was saying was true. Did it matter? No. Because the reality is, faith is what matters. This is why, again...
We're saved by grace through faith.
Correct, which is why this is important. What we're dealing with right now in Genesis is important because we are establishing that our lineage is not by blood, and it is not by the token graces of firstborn son. It is through grace. It is through faith. This is why Esau didn't matter. This is why, again, because whose mother is Judah? Leah. Where did Christ come from? The tribe of Judah. Which means that Jacob wanted who? Rachel. But it was not from Rachel's children that ultimately came our Messiah. It was through Leah. So that means that our actions, our agency, it means something, sure. But at the end of the day, our desires is not necessarily the will of God. It's not necessarily what is going to lead to our salvation and the salvation of other people. And so we have to take that into consideration, that this is turning things on its head, because ultimately what matters is not blood, but faith. This is what makes us children of Abraham.
And another thing is, going on a little bit later, God didn't want the Israelites to have a king. He wanted them to have God be their king. And they're complaining to Samuel, and finally he says, okay, let them have their king. They gave him Saul. He was a horrible king. But the Messiah came through David, the second king.
The root of Jesse.
Yeah.
And what we see throughout history is that we saw in Genesis, way back in the beginning part, when we were looking at the interactions between Eve and what would be her seed and the serpent, that male seed. And so we knew from then that Christ was going to be the one to ultimately save us. And yet, we continuously see through this history that God continuously gives us opportunities to redeem ourselves, and we continuously do what? Fail. We ask for kings, ultimately, we got kings and still didn't work out. Even with King David, who was probably the best king that ever could have been, still, even though he had the heart after God, he committed a sin that was co-equal with the devil. That David's sin is worse than Adam and Eve's sin. It has that level of horror to it. It's not just that it's adultery and murder. Because adultery and murder can be seen as, okay, sins of passion. But King David was someone that we say had a heart after God. This was not someone that was just, that didn't understand anything and didn't know anything. This is the person who knew exactly what he was and who God was and his relationship with God. And so when he sinned, he did it knowingly. He did it with full understanding of who he was and what he was able to do. So when he killed Uriah, Bathsheba's husband, he did it with full knowledge, full understanding, and completely gave himself over to sin. And for what? For lust. David had plenty of wives. David had plenty of concubines. And we see kingdoms. When David saw Bathsheba, when did he see her? When he got up from a nap in the middle of the afternoon.
There was a war and he wasn't participating.
Right.
She was taking a sunbath or something.
So she was bathing because she had probably been working. Like everyone works. So in other words, for him to get up at that hour means that he was basically lazing about. He did not have any kind of urgency. He was able to do this. So it was not out of necessity. He had to have her. So David's sin really is probably one of the worst sins in the Bible, because it is not just this idea of mistaken identity or I got lost in my passions. It was he wanted her, lusted after her, and then concocted a basically first-degree murder plan to get rid of her husband in a way that would, quote-unquote, keep his hands clean, but it's not clean because he knew exactly what was going to happen. Correct. But this is one of the reasons why Psalm 50 is so integral to our salvation and to understand. 50, 51, depending on which number you're looking at. Because there's two ways of numbering the Psalms, because at a certain point, one Psalm, in one counting, is counted as one Psalm, and another Psalm is counting on two. That's why sometimes when you're reading Psalms, you'll see in parentheses. So Psalm 50, 51, that's why they have dual numbering for the Psalms. But the Psalm of Repentance, regardless of which number you're looking at for it, is the Psalm of Repentance. And it really kind of harkens into this concept that David understood fully what his sin meant and how to repent. So we see this continuous action of the Judeans falling and falling and falling. They're given the law, didn't help them. They're given the judges, didn't help them. They're given kings, didn't help them. They went into Babylon as slaves and were brought back in repentance, still didn't help them. And ultimately, because Jesus Christ was going to be necessary. But what's important about this is that God gives us agency. God gives us the ability to make our destiny. Even though he knows what's going to happen, that is not predestination. It's foreknowledge. But we ultimately have control of our actions. We have the ability to do what we're going to do and make the decisions we're going to make. It is still my decision to make. But God basically had his backup plan from the very beginning, knowing that this was going to happen. And further, we saw this even clearer at the hospitality of Abraham, when Christ himself gave us the wood that would become the cross. When you were in Jerusalem, did you get to go to the Monastery of the Holy Cross?
No, because of my feet, I missed out on some stuff. I've got some pictures. Would you like to see them?
At the end, maybe, yes.
Okay.
But Christ himself, when he came to Abraham, gave them the staffs that would become the cross. And so this was known from the very beginning that ultimately Christ was going to have to suffer barbarically for us. The sacrifice of Abraham offering his son Isaac shows us that God would not spare his own son. So even though God still gave us all these chances because we were asking, still, he was ready for us. Now let's look at, correct, she calls his name Dan. Now Rachel's handmaiden Bilhah conceived again and bore Jacob a second son. Then Rachel said, God has helped me, and I have wrestled with my sister, and indeed I have prevailed. So she called his name Naphtali. So this is kind of getting kind of silly with the sisters wrestling over who had preeminence, because unlike Hagar and Sarah, this isn't a handmaiden. This is two sisters, and both legally married to Jacob. Now when Leah saw she had stopped bearing, she took Zilpah, her handmaiden, and gave her to Jacob as wife. So Jacob went into her, and Zilpah, Leah's handmaiden, conceived and bore Jacob a son. Then Leah said, good fortune. Thus she called his name Gad. Now Zilpah, Leah's handmaiden, bore Jacob a second son. And Leah said, I am blessed, for the woman will call me blessed. So she called his name Asher. So this competition is getting very, very weird. Now Reuben went in the days of wheat harvest and found mandrakes in the field and brought them to his mother Leah. Thus Rachel said to Leah, give me some of your son's mandrakes.
What is a mandrake?
You get a picture of it. So a mandrake is a Mandragoria is a type of species of plant genus Mandragora. It is often known as a mandrake, although this name is also used for other plants. As of 2015, sources differ significantly.
It's a plant?
It's a plant. So let me see some images. So this is what it looks like.
Oh, okay.
But she said to her, is this a small matter that you have taken away my husband? Would you also take away my son's mandrakes also?
Really good.
So Rachel said, not so. Let him lie with you tonight for your son's mandrakes. Now when Jacob came out of the field in the evening, Leah went out to meet him and said, you must come in to me, for I have surely hired you with my son's mandrakes. So he lay with her that night. Thus God listened to Leah, and she conceived and bore Jacob a fifth son. Then Leah said, God has given me my wages because I have given my handmaid to my husband. So she called his name Issachar. Wow. Oh, man.
It's like a bunch of women eating.
Now Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a sixth son. Then Leah said, God has endowed me with a good endowment. Now my husband will choose me because I have borne him six sons. So she called his name Zebulun. Afterwards she bore a daughter and called her name Dinah. Then God remembered Rachel, and God listened to her and opened her womb. Thus she conceived and bore a son, and said, God has taken away my reproach. So she called his name Joseph, and said, the Lord shall add another son to me. Now, this is, of course, significant because Joseph is going to be obviously very, very important. So we're seeing that all of these children have significance. All of these children are blessed in a way, shape, and form. And so Rachel's children are going to be important. Exactly. Now it came to pass when Rachel had borne Joseph that Jacob said to Laban, send me away that I may go to my own place and to my own country. Give me my wives and my children for whom I have served you, and let me go. For you know the service I rendered you. And Laban said to him, if I could find grace in your eyes, I would seek for it divinely, for God has blessed me by your coming. So he said, name your wages and I will give it. Oh boy, this is going to turn out well. Jacob replied, you know how I have served you and how numerous your cattle became with me. For what you had before I came was little, and has increased to a great amount. The Lord hath blessed you since my coming. Now therefore, when shall I also establish my own house? Thus Laban said to him, what shall I give you? Jacob replied, you shall not give me anything. If you will do this thing for me, I will again feed and keep your sheep. Let me pass through all your flocks today, removing from them all the gray sheep, and all the spotted and speckled among the goats, and these shall be my wages. So my righteousness will answer for me in time to come. When the subject of wages comes before you, Everyone that is not speckled and spotted among the goats and gray among the sheep will be considered stolen if it is with me. So in other words, Jacob is actually being very nice, because the spotted and the gray lambs would be considered the ones that are not the best,
Right.
because they're not white. So he's saying, give me the ones that don't look as pretty. And you would think that that's good. So he's basically saying, okay, it's going to be very clear when the time comes for me to leave. The gray and spotted and speckled ones, those are mine. The others are yours. Then Laban said to him, let it be according to your word. So he removed that day all the male goats that were speckled and spotted, all the female goats that were speckled and spotted, every one that had some white in it, and gave all the gray ones among the sheep, and gave them into the hands of his sons. Then he put 3 days' journey between himself and Jacob for the rest of Laban's flock. So, according to the Orthodox Study Bible, Jacob was made righteous by faith, as were his father Isaac and grandfather Abraham. This righteousness is a gift of God's grace, one of the 4 general virtues of wisdom. Jacob lived out this righteousness in his behavior towards his uncle Laban. So, despite the fact that all this hoopla is going on with his family, which is making it seem like a soap opera, Jacob is still faithful to God and unwilling to deal unrighteously with his uncle, despite the fact that 14 years is a long time to be an indentured servant. But of course, look at Laban's perspective. He's probably looking, he's like, I'm going to lose again, because Laban is treating it in the same way that Esau treated it and the Canaanites treated it, that God's blessing is for material gain and not appropriately. So we're going to see, unfortunately, how this turns out. Now Jacob took for himself rods of green poplar and the almond and chestnut trees, peeled white strips on them, tearing off the bark. So the white strips he had peeled approached on the rods as spotted. Then he placed the rods he had peeled in the gutters of the watering troughs where the flocks came to drink, so they should conceive at the rods as they came to drink. So the flocks conceived, bore the rods, and the flocks brought forth speckled, spotted, and ash-colored speckled. But Jacob separated the male lambs and placed a speckled ram before the sheep, and all that were spotted among the male lambs. Then he separated for himself flocks by themselves and did not mix them with the sheep of Laban. As it came to pass, whenever the sheep conceived, that Jacob placed his rods before the sheep in the gutters, so they might conceive according to the rods. But whenever the sheep had already given birth, he did not put them in. Thus it came to pass that the unmarked were Laban's and the marked were Jacob's. So the man became exceedingly rich, and had cattle and oxen, male and female servants, and camels and donkeys. So basically, Jacob was, as they were basically giving birth to their kids, basically, he was separating them out, making sure that they were continuing to be separated.
But why does it say that you got the stronger ones?
Because basically what happened is that God was blessing Jacob. So even though they were the spotted, the speckled, they ended up being the stronger. Of the sheep. So you would have thought that it'd be the pure white ones that would end up being the strong and the blessed, but it ended up being the ones that were speckled, because ultimately God was blessing Jacob. Now Jacob heard the words of Laban's son, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from our father's property he acquired all this wealth. So Jacob saw Laban's countenance, and indeed it was not favorable towards him as before. And the Lord said to Jacob, return to your father's land and to your family, I will be with you. So basically, Laban thinks he's been tricked. He thinks that Jacob has swindled him and cheated him, and it's not looking good. And yet we see that God is still with Jacob. From verse 3, it says, the Lord is the Word and Son of God. He told Jacob to return to the land of his father, for this land was a type of the world to come. Laban's country was not Jacob's permanent residence. So in other words, it's time to leave. So Jacob sent and called Rachel and Leah to the field where the flocks were, and said to them, I see your father's countenance, that it is not favorable towards me as before, but the God of my father has been with me. Now you know that with all my might I served your father. Yet your father deceived me and changed my wages 10 times with respect to the male lambs. But God did not allow him to harm me. If he said thus, the speckled shall be your wages, then all the flocks bore speckled. But if he said, the white shall be your wages, then all the sheep bore white. So God has taken away all your father's cattle and given them to me. So in other words, Laban kept trying to cheat Jacob. Well, wait a minute. Those are better. Give them to me.
Yeah.
So the other one prospered.
Well, Laban was Jacob's uncle, right?
Yes. Laban is, forgive me, my brain's drawing a blank.
Isaac's cousin.
Well, it's Isaac's cousin, but it's Isaac and Rebecca?
Rebecca's son.
Hang on a second, let me flip back a little bit.
Laban is Rebecca's
I
son.
think so.
Rebecca, yes. So yeah, this is Rebecca's brother.
Okay.
So this is his direct uncle,
Okay.
which if we're looking at it from today's societal standpoints, this is a little bit you, because he's marrying his first cousin, which from what I understand.
Can't do that today.
No. But again, this wasn't about the idea of pure blood genealogy. It was about the idea of keeping it in the faith.
Mhm.
So, starting from verse 10. Now it came to pass, when the flocks conceived, I lifted my eyes and saw in a dream. Behold, the male goats and the rams that were speckled, spotted, and ash-colored speckled were mating with the sheep and the goats. Then the angel of God spoke to me in a dream, saying, Jacob. Thus I said, Here I am. So he said, Lift your eyes now and see all the male goats and the rams mating with the sheep, and the goats are speckled, spotted, and ash-colored speckled. For I have seen everything Laban is doing to you. I am the God who appeared to you at Bethel, where you anointed the pillar and made a vow to me. Now then, arise, get out of this land, and return to the land of your nativity, and I will be with you. The Orthodox Study Bible says, the Word is also called the angel of God because it is he alone who reveals the Father, and also because when the Son is beheld, so is the Father, for he is the Father's radiance. Therefore, the Father and the Son are one. In verse 11, the name God refers to the Father, but in this verse, the angel is called the God who appeared. Thus, the Son is the true God of true God. So in other words, what we're understanding here is that this is Jesus Christ appearing to Jacob in this moment. Then Rachel and Leah answered and said to him, Is there still any portion or inheritance for us in our father's house? Are we not considered strangers by him? For he sold us, and also completely consumed our money. For all the riches and glory God has taken from our father are really ours and our children's. Now then, whatever God has said to you, do it. So they're not exactly thrilled with the way that Laban dealt with their husband, because it's so discord between the sisters. They see that their dad has essentially tried to swindle Jacob again and again and again and again. And the reality is that all of these things were supposed to be the dowry that was supposed to be, their inheritance going to him. So instead of treating them like daughters, treated them like property.
Like what?
Property.
Oh, yeah.
Then Jacob rose and set his sons and his wives on camels, and he carried away all his livestock and all his possessions acquired in Mesopotamia and everything belonging to him to go to his father Isaac in Canaan. Now Laban had gone to shear his sheep, and Rachel had stolen her father's idols. Uh-oh. But Jacob had hidden from Laban the Syrian his intention of running away. So he fled with all that he had and crossed the river and headed for the mountain of Gilead. Then Laban was told in the third day that Jacob had fled. So he took all his brethren with him and pursued him for 7 days' journey and overtook him in the mountains of Gilead. But God had come to Laban the Syrian in a dream by night and said to him, Be careful that you do not speak evil things to Jacob at any time. So Laban overtook Jacob. Now Jacob had pitched his tent in the mountains, and Laban with his brethren pitched in the mountains of Gilead. Then Laban said to Jacob, What have you done, that you have stolen away unknown to me and robbed me and carried away my daughters like captives taken with the sword? Why did you flee away secretly and steal away from me and not tell me? For I might have sent you away with joy and songs, with timbrel and harp. And you did not allow me to kiss my sons and my daughters. Now you have done foolishly in so doing. It is my power to do you harm. The God of your father spoke to me last night, saying, Be careful that you do not speak evil things to Jacob at any time. Now you're surely gone because you greatly long for your father's house. But why did you steal my goods, my gods? So what do we notice now about Laban and his worship?
he worshipped false gods, but he did hear God's.
Correct. We've seen that multiple times that God does not only speak to the Jews. This is not going to be the only time where God intercedes with his people. So this is showing the falsehood of his gods, but it also shows that Laban is unwilling to, step over bound because he understands he will be dealt with harshly. The threat is very, very palpable. Laban calls the word the God of Jacob's father, that is, the God of Isaac. Laban's problem was his unbelief, for he did not believe in the very one who appeared to him in a dream.
Where are you?
He was just reading
From the notes.
Oh, okay.
So starting at verse 31. Then Jacob answered and said to Laban, because I was afraid, for I said, perhaps you would take your daughters and all my possessions from me by force. With whomever you find your gods, let him not live in the presence of our brethren. Identify what I have of yours and take it with you. For Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. Thus Laban went in and searched Leah's tent and found nothing. He searched Jacob's and those of the handmaids but found nothing. Then entered Rachel's tent, and Rachel had taken the idols, put them in the camel's saddle, and sat on them. He said to her father, let it not displease my lord that I cannot rise before you, for the manner of women is with me. So he searched the entire tent but did not find the idols. It's a very clever way of getting out of having to get off the camel. Exactly. Then Jacob was angry and rebuked Laban, and Jacob answered and said to Laban, what is my injustice? What is my sin that you so hotly pursued me? Although you searched all my things, what part of your household goods have you found? Set them before my brethren and your brethren, so that they may judge between us. These 20 years I have been with you. Your sheep and your female goats have not miscarried their young, and I have not eaten the rams of your flock. That which was caught by wild animals I did not bring to you. I bore the loss of any stolen by day or by night. There I was in the day, and the drought consumed me, and the frost by night, and my sleep departed from my eyes. Thus I have been in your house 20 years. I served you 14 for your 2 daughters, and 6 for your flock. And you have changed my wages 10 times with respect to the female lambs. Unless the God of my father Abraham and the fear of Isaac has been with me, surely now you would have sent me away empty-handed. But God saw my affliction and the labor of my hands and rebuked you last night. So according to the Orthodox Study Bible, Jacob believed in the Son of God and thanked him for rebuking Laban for his injustice. Laban was a liar and a cheat, for he had changed Jacob's wages 10 times. In all this, Jacob, so to speak, had stepped aside and allowed the Lord to fight his battles over the 20-year period. Now, this is important because so many times we want to fight our own battles. And ultimately, what happens when we try to fight our own battles?
We lose.
We lose. We fail. When ultimately, we should let God fight our battles. Now, here's the thing. Yes, Rachel stole the idols. But Jacob didn't know that. And so Jacob is dealing as righteously as he can. And he's right to feel indignant. And even now, he is not telling his father-in-law, his uncle, forget you, get out of here. He's saying, look, if I have anything of yours, take it. Search us. You've got us. Take it. There's nothing. And so he's saying, God rightly chastised you. Now, I wish we could continue with this. Well, you know what? Let's go ahead and finish this last section of 31, and then we'll go to questions. Then Laban answered and said to Jacob, these daughters are my daughters, and these sons are my sons, and these sheep are my sheep. All you see belongs to me and my daughters. But what can I do for them today, for the children they bore? Now therefore come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let it be a witness between you and me. And said, look, there's no one with us. God himself is witness between you and me. So Jacob took a stone and set it up as a pillar. Then Jacob said to his brethren, gather stones. So they took stones and made a heap. And they ate and drank there on the heap. And Laban said to him, this heap is a witness between you and me today. Laban called it the heap of testimony, but Jacob called it the witness heap. Then Laban said, this heap and this pillar are a witness between you and me this day. Therefore its name was called this heap witnesses. And also the vision, because he said, may God watch between you and me when we are absent one from another. If you humble my daughters, or if you take other wives besides my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me. Then Laban said to Jacob, listen, this heap and the pillar are a witness. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and this pillar to me for harm. The God of Abraham and the God of Nahor judge between us. Thus Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac, and Jacob offered a sacrifice on the mountain and called his brethren. They ate bread and drank and stayed all night on the mountain. So now they live in peace. Now, obviously a lot of things happened in today's passage, as we talked about basically the story of Jacob, Leah, and Rachel. With the time that we have left, are there any questions, thoughts, concerns, or reflections?
Just about Laban, I don't know if we dig any further into the story about him, but basically he was not part of the faith.
Correct.
Laban wasn't, no.
No, and this is, we have to understand where these people came from. They look at God as somehow the God who is stronger than the other gods. The idea of El Shaddai, the God of the mountain. And so they were not seeing him as the one true God. Abraham was the first one that really understood this concept of the one true God, following after him, serving him, and all of his household. That's why they all from his household bore the mark of circumcision to show that they are servants of this God. So Laban did not have that.
Laban wasn't circumcised?
No, because he was not part of Abraham's household.
Okay.
Well, my confusion, I thought when he went to Laban that, and the other son, Ishmael, went to another tribe, that they were all believing in God, that they were all,
Keep in mind that in this area of the world, there is so much plurality of worship, of gods. Okay, so this coffee cup is a god. This cell phone is, well, this is a false god. But there's so many quote-unquote gods. But the idea is that the Canaanites are worshiping their style of God. But Nahor and all his people and the Syrian people, they're all kind of worshiping similarly. They're all worshiping similarly to the way that Abraham worshiped. They're coming from the same place. And this kind of speaks to the idea that it's very, very hard for people to walk together if they're coming from absolutely, completely disparate backgrounds. This is one of the reasons why in the church, we will allow marriage between Christian and Christian, but we do not allow marriage between Christian and Jew, or Christian and Muslim, or Christian and Taoist, or Christian and Hindu, or Christian and Shinto, all because the idea is that how are you supposed to walk together on a common goal towards a common God if you're worshiping completely different things? You're worshiping in a completely different way. At least with these people, they're worshiping in a similar way. They're coming from the same background, same kind of ethnic identity and heritage, which allows them to be able to coalesce together. Now, ultimately, in this context here, we're looking at as the idea of homogeny of culture and background. But ultimately, what we're going to get to, which is why ultimately this is important, is because it's going to be the homogeny of faith, not race, not blood, not country. So it's all about keeping it together right now to basically single it in, because with so many different religious practices, if it all swarmed in, it could pollute it, dilute it, and destroy it. And this is one of the reasons it's so critical that this bloodline stay together, because they had the same style of worship, the same understanding of gods, even if they didn't understand yet that there's only one true God.
Right.
They understood that, okay, Abraham is very, very close with his God. And this gives him power, this gives him authority, this gives him agency. But they figured, okay, but we have our gods too. We're going to see this again and again and again, especially during the time of Elijah against the cult of Baal, where they just figured, okay, well, our God is strong, your God is strong, let's have a God off. When they had that contest in the mountain, on Mount Carmel. So this is still part of the process of revelation.
I've been there, Mount Carmel.
So any other questions, thoughts, or comments?
No, I'm going to study this because
It is very, very interesting, I feel. And so next week, we will continue with the story of Jacob's children, and hopefully get as far as we can into the story of Joseph. And I believe so. Let me look
That's the day before Thanksgiving.
Oh, I take it back. No, we will not be meeting next week. Wednesday before Thanksgiving, absolutely not. No, we will not be meeting next week. Week after, where we will go into the story of Joseph in his amazing Technicolor dream coat. Which is fun because for a lot of people, understanding the concept of dreams and what do they mean and do we pay attention to them, it's something that gets questioned a lot. So I love when we go into the story of Joseph to understand kind of what spiritual gifts mean and how we are to interpret them. Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of Truth, present in all places, filling all things, come and dwell in us, cleanse every stain, and save our souls, Lord. Amen. Have a wonderful, wonderful day.
Thank you.
This is